So welcome everybody to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, our 312th, being recorded on Thursday, December 12th, 2024 at noon Eastern, we've got Dakota Clum, who's going to be offering us his CF Summit 2024 presentation, From Development to Deployment, Load Testing ColdFusion Applications. And before I turn it over to Dakota, I just want to remind everybody down there at the bottom, you can see that the URL for the meetup is coldfusionmeetup.com, makes it easy to find. And this session and all sessions are posted on YouTube. So this is being live streamed and recorded at the same time. So when the meeting's over, you can point anybody to the same URL you're looking at right now, and they'll be able to watch the meeting afterwards. So with that, let's go ahead and turn things over to Dakota. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Charlie. Appreciate you having me on, and
yeah.
I hope we can use today to share some insight just on some load testing practices and what options are out there. So with that, I'll kind of jump right in. As Charlie already mentioned, this topic will be going over, from development to deployment, load testing our CF applications and what that means. Just before we get started here, just briefly, who am I? So I'm the CTO at xByte Cloud. I have a background in ColdFusion server solutions in the private cloud, on-prem, even in the public cloud. So I've had a unique opportunity to tune, optimize, load test ColdFusion environments. And I hope today I can share some of my hands-on tips or just things I've learned over the years as we kind of dive into this discussion. So why load test, or what can we, or what will we be covering today? What I'm hoping to cover is application load testing. What tools are out there and what information can you use to load test any mission critical CF applications? I want to go over some load testing tools to simulate what would happen under different load testing scenarios. As you think about your own application, what is there that you have to load test? Are you a storefront? That's doing, people browsing to your site, they're looking at your storefront, adding items to a cart. What we can do is really simulate that load and understand the performance or even the tolerance of your application. So today we'll uncover some load testing tools that are available to simulate a real visitor traffic. We'll review tools that can be used to capture additional metrics from the server during a load test. That's also a really critical component. And then, of course, we'll talk about scaling considerations and monitoring your applications at scale. So going into more about why load testing. So we can leverage load testing to identify bottlenecks and applications pre-production. So before pushing anything to production, you want to understand your application's performance capabilities. Are there any bottlenecks, and what's your tolerance for bottlenecks? As we start to think about load testing, we kind of have to establish a baseline. Does your application have SLA requirements? Is there a certain amount of optimum uptime you must achieve? Do you have a response time metric that you're being graded against? Does your app have to always load within 200 milliseconds? When we start thinking about load testing, has your app ever been impacted by unexpected performance loss after an update or even a code push? Does your application degrade over several days or hours or even weeks? Load testing can really be used as a tool, or a proactive and preventative tool, to identify bottlenecks and performance issues within your applications. Not only that, but load testing should be a regular part of your workflow. You don't want to load test once and forget about it for 2 years. Really, you can make it a part of your daily workflow, or even as a part of your development life cycle. And we'll talk more about that later. But a proper load testing workflow will identify unexpected issues, introduced through code changes, and it could also help identify leaks, application timeouts, and any kind of scalability issues. We can use load testing to better understand our application's overall performance. And identify scalability limitations. Let's briefly talk about load testing considerations. I know this is a ColdFusion meetup or ColdFusion topic, but there's more components outside of just ColdFusion that could be impacted by a load test or impacted by bottlenecks. So of course, load testing goes beyond just the ColdFusion server or even the web server for that matter. Every component of an application's ecosystem must be accounted for. How is the database performing? What's going on at the storage layer? Are you calling out to Stripe or PayPal and submitting payment processing? How is that performing? How's that, the server's actual resource utilization doing? Is it, are you high on CPU? Are you running out of memory? If a web page is slower than expected or the metrics you're getting back are slower than expected, consider all components that are at play. When load testing your application, you should monitor the responsiveness of third-party dependencies as well. We'll talk about some tools that you can utilize to help do that. But obviously, we'll be paying close attention to ColdFusion, but just consider what else is out there, and consider what tools you can use to assess that information. As we kind of think about a load testing scenario and load testing our own applications, let's kind of assess our app requirements. You should be defining performance expectations for your application. What constitutes acceptable performance? Is it response time? Is it throughput? Is it error rate? You may find that 99.9% of the time your application performs great, and maybe 0.1% of the time there's 500 errors, or a user is getting a timeout. That may be acceptable, and for others it may not be. So you should really define a baseline and kind of put together KPIs on what you want to achieve, when you're assessing your app requirements and what you're being graded against. Determine the types of scenarios that you can test, such as your normal load. What's a normal day look like? Your peak load, and then overload conditions. Maybe you're a storefront and you have a Black Friday sale, and your application gets 10 times more traffic for the day. Your application may not be configured or sustainable enough to handle that increased load. And we can use load testing tools to help assess that. Assessing your performance and system health does require that you have a proper monitoring and kind of observability solution. There's tools out there like Grafana, Zabbix. We have Fusion Reactor, which I'm sure we've all heard of. You have Datadog, and of course, ColdFusion's performance monitoring toolset. All of these tools out there can be used to monitor endpoints. You can deploy agents on the server to say, how's the Java heap space of my ColdFusion application doing? What does the request time look like? How is the CPU performing? You can assess all of this externally, while in the middle of a load test, to really see how your application behaves and where's the bottleneck lie. As you look over your server's performance metrics, again, we'll want to keep a close watch on CPU, RAM, disk, latency, even, or network. If you're running into any kind of bandwidth limitations, that's something to look closely at. And fine tune and adjust your resources as needed. I'll talk a little bit more a few slides up about what resource limitations or adjustments can be made, but maybe you do need more CPU, or maybe you do need more RAM, or maybe the server has plenty of resources and ColdFusion just not configured to leverage all of it. There's Java heap space settings that can be adjusted. And all of that's going to help with the throughputs and the availability of your application. I'm looking into the load testing ecosystem. Something I wanted to talk a little bit about is what tools are out there. Of course, there's not a one size fits all tool. And there's several more beyond this, just in this load testing landscape. So I figured I could talk about open source, or free and premium load testing options. One of the more popular tools that I'm sure a lot of you have heard before is Apache JMeter. It's mainly, most popular because it's easy to use. It's based on a GUI. You can download it and have it set up in a matter of minutes. It does have wide community adoption, and it's still actively used today. So there's plenty of community resources out there to build, acceptance testing and defining load testing. It does have some built-in reporting capabilities, so you can visualize, how is a server performing over time, and you can export that data and present that in a broader report. And it does even have containerization support. So if you're not load testing a traditional VM, or you're in a containerized environment, you can use a Apache JMeter in that context as well. Another tool, which we'll talk about much more today, is K6 Grafana. This is a tool that's CLI driven, so you control it from the CLI. It allows you to define load tests that are written as code. Of course, it supports containerization. It does contain some modern tools and components. Support for reports and CI/CD integration. And there's a consideration there that we'll talk more about. And I figured some honorable mentions would be around premium. Premium tools. You have WebLoad, Gatling. There's several other ones out there, but that's a little bit about the ecosystem. First, I'll talk briefly about Apache JMeter, just for anyone who's familiar with the GUI and wants to make that a part of their load testing strategy, just based on the ease of use. You can simulate load tests through their GUI. If you look at the screenshot I have on the right-hand side, you can see I've, named a project essentially called my cart application, my CF cart application. And I know that my users are going to, hit the landing page. They're going to navigate to the storefront. They're going to go to checkout, and then they're going to do payments. And what I've done with this load test, very simple, and I set this up within minutes, is, I know that all my users are going to be browsing to the storefront. Some of them are going to submit payments. Some are going to check out, etc. And as I increased my load testing thresholds, I saw that everyone was making it to the storefront, which is great. And as that test went longer and longer, I started seeing errors on my payment page and my checkout page, and even my landing page started, getting errors. So that's the whole point of a load test, is really to simulate, okay, what's my peak traffic, or, what's my sustained traffic throughout the day, and what happens if I, perform a load test, or set a threshold of a load test, over a 12-hour period, or even over a few minute period. When do I start seeing errors, or when do I start seeing signs of degradation? One of the advantages of Apache JMeter, it automatically displays the results in a GUI-friendly dashboard. You see, I could add, a summary report. I can aggregate, get aggregated data and put that into a graph, and response time graphs. You can tune and optimize your server configuration, based on the results of this load test, and continue, doing that same load test multiple times and generating multiple reports to see what changes, or what impact your changes have had on the, the overall reliability of the app. You can simulate real user traffic and use load testing as an opportunity to identify bottlenecks and performance issues. It's, I already mentioned, it's easy to set up. It does have session support. So if, as users are adding, maybe some users add one item to the cart and other users add 5 items to the cart, you can add logic that will go in and simulate all that for you, where some requests are adding one item, some are adding 2, some are adding 10, and you can see how your application behaves. Collects and displays metric through various reports. So that's Apache JMeter. Again, it's an honorable mention. It's GUI based. Next, I want to talk a little bit about load testing, or simulated load tests with K6, which is a tool I pointed out earlier. It is by Grafana. And I think this is, especially for the developer community out there, this kind of tooling, or this capability that you can deploy locally on your own machine. You can attach to a CI/CD pipeline, or test externally. Will really resonate with a lot of users out there. So a little bit about K6. K6 tests are all written in JavaScript. It's easy to build a load test scenario with plenty of examples and documentation out there. Just like Apache JMeter, you can install K6 and have it running in a matter of minutes. Um, you can install it locally on your your personal machine. It's supported on Mac, Linux, Windows, etc. And you can start performing functional tests on your application within a matter of minutes. You do have the option to submit K6 performance load testing results directly into a Grafana dashboard with a Grafana enabled K6 plugin. And for anybody here that uses Grafana or is familiar with Grafana, you can take all of the load testing metrics that K6 aggregated for you, and they'll put that into pretty dashboards that, allow you to really visualize your performance and see trends over time. That could be done in their cloud or even to your own locally self-hosted Grafana instance. A bonus of this K6 load testing tool is that there is a browser plugin to actually record your test scenarios. So if you don't know exactly how you want to write the JavaScript code to um, define your load test, you could go to your site, you could enable this browser plugin, and you could browse to each page. Okay, I have a visitor, they go here, they click this blog, they scroll down halfway, and K6 will take that, or that browser plugin will take that and convert it into K6 JavaScript code that defines that load test for you. And then you could say, I want 100 users to do that same exact thing, or maybe I want to add variations. So, you can define your user journey with code or through a browser-based plugin, that will generate the script for you, and then you can load test the application under your expected traffic patterns. Looking over kind of a simple K6 test, um, I'll talk over this, and then we can get into more specifics of the results afterwards. So kind of simulating a load test through code. This is exactly what K6 defined load tests look like. As you can see on the right-hand side here, I've defined a simple multi-step load test scenario, of course, written in JavaScript with various ramp up and ramp down stages. In my stages that I've defined, you can see that I have a 20-second duration of a peak load stage, or what I anticipate to be peak load. And that's, trying to hit a target of 100 users, and it's sustaining that load or ramping down that load for 10 seconds after the fact. So there's, several users that I expect to hit the application at one point. Of course, 20 seconds is a small number. You could make that, hours, even days, if you wanted to try synthetic or, sustained load testing over multiple days. It supports simultaneous visitors, so it's not just going to be, synchronous requests, but all of these are asynchronous. Really, the only limitation of performing a load test is the machine doing the load test to the, the CF server or your application server. So you could set up multiple visitors, multiple sessions, and really put your application to the test. You'll see that there's an export default function defined within the JavaScript code here that performs an HTTP request to each page defined within the block. You'll see step one, and you'll see this also correlates with the Apache JMeter test I set up. But step one is browsing to the storefront. I'm looking for a 200 code and I'm logging that to the console. Step two, I'm adding an item to the cart. As we think about JavaScript coding or logic that can be added, you could have, parameters that you specify on your cart page or on that add to cart, where maybe some quantities are 1 and then other quantities are 6 or 7 or 8. So just keep that in mind as you define. I mean, this is JavaScript, so you do have a lot of flexibility in how you define the test. Of course, step 3 is proceeding to the checkout, and I'll iterate, and add a, sleep of 1 second after the fact. And my test, that I've defined in my stages here, that's going to perform for up to 100 users simultaneously are going to be hitting those URLs that are defined within that function. This example, of course, is being performed locally, but it should be performed in as close to a production setting as possible. So you see my URLs are all local host. I don't expect my machine to be able to sustain a high amount of load. But as you have a development environment, whether it be in the cloud or on premise, if you can make that close to your production environment, you can really see what the limitations of your application are. Um, define your normal traffic patterns and peak traffic patterns, and specify those throughout your conditions or your duration stages within your K6 test. And next, we'll kind of talk about reviewing the load testing results. So like I said earlier, this is a CLI-driven app. So you can deploy this locally on your machine and begin performing tests. One thing about K6 that I've appreciated is that it's easy to interpret the output and kind of see what, how did my application perform? As you kind of look on the right-hand side here to the output, you can see my HTTP request duration average, what's the minimum that was achieved, what was the maximum, to see, what is the, how's my application performing, or what's my average. What percentage of requests failed. When we go back to KPIs and thinking about what we want, the results to be, maybe your KPI is 0% failure. Well, you'll see here that in the output of my test, I browsed to the storefront and 89% of those succeeded, but over 200 of those requests failed. And then same for adding items to the cart or purchasing an item. I've had a less than 90% success ratio. So that's a good indicator that I'm running into some kind of limitation, whether that be CF or the server itself, who knows? And we'll kind of go over how can we identify that. You can expand on the logic of your load tests with defined thresholds. So you'll see you could have logic within the JavaScript that says, my KPI for this request is it's a 500 millisecond response time or better. If it's not, flag it. And then I can look at how many requests took over 500 milliseconds to load. You can define that request failures should not exceed a certain percentile. So if you reach some kind of sustained failure that violates one of your KPIs or metrics you're trying to achieve, that will be easily identifiable. I mentioned it earlier, but these K6 generated tests, they can actually be included as a part of your development lifecycle. Particularly, you don't have to just do these tests manually. Although a lot of them are performed that way, you can also attach this K6 functionality to your CI/CD pipeline. So every time you push a change to production or staging, you could set up a defined acceptance test based on the KPIs or the tolerance you've set for your application. And every every push or build that you perform on your pipelines, that K6 test can run. You can verify all of your thresholds have been met. And if for some reason there was an error identified, that will be pointed out directly in your CI/CD process. And right away that a code change that has been pushed has had unexpected impact. K6 scripts can also be used for more like synthetic monitoring. So you don't have to run a K6 script for 5 minutes to understand the performance of your app. You could run these, forever if you wanted, or you could even simulate a load test that says, hey, I just want one user or one visitor hitting the site at all time, just, kind of doing a smoke test or, what's going on with the app. And you can have that happen over multiple days and set up thresholds and alerting around that metric as well. I did mention that we can send load testing results to Grafana. Of course, Grafana does have their own cloud where you could deploy a free cloud environment, free to a certain point, of course. But essentially, you can, if you wanted to play with the results and visualize kind of the results of your load test, you do have that option. Of course, you can deploy Grafana locally, and you'll have that option as well to send the results there. But ship your load testing results to Grafana to visualize, your test. This is just a small snippet of the dashboard that Grafana creates for a K6 Grafana dashboard. but there's multiple metrics that can be visualized. Latency, response time, error, threshold, time. It's all timestamp supported. So just keep in mind you can review those load testing results directly within a dashboard if you're more of a visual person, and don't prefer to look at your load test results in a CLI, for example. Um, Keep in mind you can use these to observe metrics and application performance over time. So you may have noticed, or even historically, you may have noticed that within the last 30 days, something in the app has changed based on historical metrics that your app is loading 30 milliseconds slower, or maybe it's 2 seconds slower. You can really define that with the historical data that's available within Grafana. So keep that in mind as well. Load testing via a cron job or CI/CD. Something that I encourage everyone to do, that particularly developers or anyone that's deploying server infrastructure, is make load testing a core component of your software development lifecycle. There's been, I would say in several instances, I've talked to end users or developers, they've never even done a load test or didn't know it was available to them. So it should be a critical or core aspect of your life cycle. It's, how's my app behaving after every code change I make? You can attach your K6 load test to your pipelines and have it run during every execution. So if you're using Azure DevOps, GitLab, GitHub, um, K6 can be deployed to their agents and they can be executed, execute your customized K6 script to perform a load test, and they'll send that result back to you, all in a single streamlined pipeline deployment. Keep in mind that some pipelines may run into scalability or compute issues depending on the complexity of your load testing. So, when you're deploying to a pipeline, let's just say in GitLab or GitHub or Azure DevOps, the actual agent or machine that pipeline executes on, it can only do so much. So, when you're doing stuff via CI/CD, one, make sure the agents you're executing the tests on are capable of meeting the needs of that test. And if they can't, maybe, try to scale it back and use it as more of a smoke test. And then you can do the more intensive load testing on an offsite server or something more external with more resources available. Consider load testing through a cloud solution that can support complex load tests as your needs grow. So when we think about if I need to generate 1 million requests and I really want to do a high sustained peak traffic test, you can work with a cloud provider. If you have your own hardware, you can really define those tests and what your expectations are. For applications that do not leverage CI/CD, there's still users out there that aren't using Git repositories to kind of maintain their code base. There is still an option. You can leverage like a cron job or scheduled tasks that executes that script locally, whether that be in a separate environment or even directly on the server. Of course, you can use Windows. If you're deployed on Windows Server, you can use a built-in task scheduler. If you're using Linux, you have the cron tab where you can just say, hey, every 6 hours, execute the script and store the output here, or email us the results. That's an option. Just consider scheduling tests or load tests routinely and then storing those historical metrics so that you can refer to them over, prolonged periods of time. As we get into more advanced load testing topics or scenarios, one thing that can be implemented as a strategy for your load testing is you may have users all over the US or even globally. You can set up distributed load testing where they're all interconnected. That says, hey, what's the performance of my site from the East Coast or Central US or even the West Coast or anywhere globally. You can, that's all natively supported within K6 so that you can test for multiple locations and see how the app is behaving. You may find that, users in the East Coast have much higher latency. And that could be based on the data center location of your hosting provider or wherever your app is located. Um, so keep that in mind as well, and you may find that you need to scale the application, to more geographic locations to support, a certain segment or certain geographical location to get better performance results for your app. So keep that in mind, especially if you know you're serving a wide range or wide audience that could be geographically dispersed. How does the application behave when accessed globally or from specific regions? How does the latency difference impact the load test results? You may find that everything works in central US. Um, and if that's the only place you ever tested, you may have users that have never reached out or never even made it through your site because they were so slow. They were located somewhere else. So use distributed load testing to assess performance across multiple geographies. Distributed load testing is supported via K6 and Apache JMeter, and I'm sure a lot of other tools that are available out there as well. Um, really ideally, if you're expecting, load from multiple geographic locations, the metrics are consistent. For each distribution test, you want to get those as close as possible. As we look into more of an advanced load testing, this is another scenario I put together. And I should probably also add, as you look into K6 or as you look into load testing your own application, there are plenty of examples online for K6. There's a big developer community behind it. I'm sure there's several repositories where you can pull things in and just update your URL and, add your own customization. But just keep that in mind. As we look at an advanced load testing scenario, I've taken it a few steps further than the first test that we performed. So I've added session support. You'll see at the beginning of the script, I'm referencing an HTTP cookie jar. So it's creating a new cookie or a new session for each one of my target users. I've changed the browsing behavior of each virtual user. So I have some that add up to one item to their cart. I have some that add up to 6 items. You can see I've defined that under step 2, where I'm defining again, this is JavaScript. So I'm using, native JavaScript functionality to define an item count, to do a get random int between 1 and 6. And that's the acceptance or the thresholds I'm setting for what I expect my visitors to do. Some will have 1, some will have 6, and some will have 3. And then, of course, as I add the item to the cart, I'm using that same cookie I defined in step 1 to make sure that session gets maintained across each request and each page. I've added sleep logic, so add a 1 second or a 0.5 second delay between each item that gets added to the cart. So I may be adding across multiple pages or across multiple products. And I've also set a threshold that requires or I'm looking for a threshold that says, report all 200 errors and report all 500 errors. Let's see, 95% of my requests should be under 200 milliseconds. Just as we expand on this test, keep in mind the kind of logic you can add all natively through JavaScript. So that's a more advanced test. Again, you can support cookies. You can really simulate users beyond just a single lost session. This is also important from like a CF context of session variables or anything you're storing in the session. If I'm storing all the card information in the session scope, and then I have 1,000 people doing that at the same time, I may find that I exhaust all the memory available in ColdFusion. Those are the kind of scenarios you can really load test against. As what's my session tolerance? How many simultaneous users can I support, and do I have room to increase that to be able to support more users? All that's supported from a load testing scenario. Looking into kind of greater observability. You can gain deeper insights in your application's overall performance. I'll name a few tools. Of course, there's several that are out there. As we talk more specifically to ColdFusion or Java-based applications, there's tools like Fusion Reactor. You have the ColdFusion performance monitoring toolset. You can use these tools to really assess or identify the JVM performance. ColdFusion is running on a JVM, a Java virtual machine. So there's heap utilization, there's garbage collection metrics. All these metrics that can be forgotten about at times are all critical to the app, performing well under load. So, are you running out of Java heap space? Is there room to increase it? Fusion Reactor, ColdFusion's performance monitoring toolset, that will help you visualize that. What's the threshold, or am I near my threshold? Don't forget about your third-party dependencies. Back earlier in the slides, I had mentioned, you may be doing mail or API calls, or have database intensive tasks. Establish monitoring for all of those components, and not, don't worry about just ColdFusion. If you're using, just Fusion Reactor, just performance monitoring toolset, and not looking at everything else, you could see slowness reported in a monitoring tool, but you'd have no idea that your database is consuming 100% of the CPU. If you're really just focused on one aspect of the application. So there are monitoring tool sets out there, Zabbix, Datadog. There's several other ones where you can set up thresholds and triggers for disk space, how's the CPU utilization, RAM, any kind of third-party APIs, etc. Just for some monitoring considerations, this is really for more applications that are getting a lot more traffic. Consider when to deploy external and internal monitoring solutions. And what I mean by that is some monitoring solutions may add an element of overhead that needs to be considered for individual applications. So when you add, if the Zabbix agent, let's just say, can't keep up with the amount of requests and the amount of logs that are being generated, that could actually harm the server. So you'd want to use Zabbix to test from an external standpoint. What does an outside user look like? So just some considerations there. Use monitoring and kind of observability tools to understand your application's performance, especially under a load test. Just as we kind of think about ColdFusion tuning options, there's several options out there, and there's a lot of documentation on this topic. I'll just point out some common ones that I see when I think about load test limitations or bottlenecks that are identified. Just some helpful tuning tips and tricks. You can adjust your request thresholds. I find them to be low for a lot of applications. And then for some applications, they've never been touched and it's always been fine. Been fine. So adjust your simultaneous request thresholds. How many simultaneous template requests do you expect to get? How many components are going to be accessed in a request across multiple users? Same with CF thread, or anything else that is available within the ColdFusion administrator within the request tuning section. You can adjust your cache thresholds for templates and even cache queries. So as we think about, if each user I'm running the same query in a load test over and over and over, and I'm not caching that, but it's a static query, you could improve your tolerance or improve the reliability of that page by caching that query and just referencing it in memory. Make a note of your session timeouts and your cache query timeouts. Something I've seen a lot, particularly in a load testing context, is what is the memory footprint of your application generating. So when you're under peak load, you may find that you have so many sessions that are referenced in memory because they have, let's say a 20-minute timeout, session timeout. Each one of those sessions are referenced in ColdFusion's memory, or Java for that case, and that can exhaust the heap space on the server. So just keep that in mind from a, as you load tests, is there anything you could do to adjust the session timeout? If you have it set to 8 days and you're trying to test for, 1 million users, that's going to be very hard to sustain. just keep in mind what you're caching and then how often you're caching it in between individual tests, and modify that as you see fit. You can adjust the session timeouts and the query timeouts, and you can set those on a per application basis. As far as configuration changes go, you can increase the minimum and maximum threshold for ColdFusion's Java heap space region. And what I mean by that is when CF is installed or you deploy it in a server environment, if you've never taken a look at those thresholds, there's, the Java heap space threshold. I think the default may be 1 GB, but you may have an application depending on the load and, what kind of tasks are being performed that really needs to be set at 4 GB of Java heap space or 8. So as you start to load test your application, you may find that you're getting something like out of memory errors, and you'll see a complaint about Java heap space. You can fine tune that threshold to meet your application's needs. The only caveat I would point out with that is, of course, there's a threshold. You can only increase Java heap space so much before you really need to look into, okay, what's using up all the memory, and is there some kind of bug in my code that a load test is triggering. That can be fixed with a simple code change, and I don't need a 12 GB heap environment. There's also the connector thresholds. These are the connectors that are passed, or that are interact with the web servers when they receive traffic to ColdFusion. It gets passed off for processing. There is a connection pool limits, or how many simultaneous requests can be supported. All of those values can be changed. You can adjust Tomcat's max threads value to match your connection pool size. So if you adjust the Tomcat connector to say be 1,000, or have a pool that's up to 1,000, if your Tomcat max threads don't match that value, you'll run out of the limitation within Tomcat, before the connector ever does. That could lead to issues as well. Just keep in mind there are tuning adjustments that can be made out there. Scalability considerations. I just throw this out here. It's very high level, of course, and there's much more considerations beyond just these, but something that I've seen implemented in live settings that have worked well. As you think about deploying or scaling your ColdFusion application, let's start by looking at application dependencies. And I'm always focused on, what does the application use, and is it on the same server as ColdFusion? When I think about ColdFusion, I look at ColdFusion as, it has its own overhead and its own resource requirements. If you have a database on the same server right next to it, they may get along fine, but in a load test, or when you're defining KPIs or assessing your performance, you may see that the database uses all the resources and ColdFusion begins struggling, or the other way around. So when possible, especially as you're gaining traction or kind of scaling your app, you should separate dependencies of your CF environment into their own unique deployments. Can you separate the database and the web server into two separate servers? Are you using mail to deliver, all kinds of mail through the CF mail tag? Well, that could be compute intensive. Maybe it's using up all the CPU, and then ColdFusion gets a bottleneck. I typically would recommend separating those as well. Deploy monitoring and management solutions externally. I mentioned that briefly earlier. Monitor what you can outside of the production environment. It's an external, test, or synthetic load test for that matter. Is, what can you look at externally to know that there's an issue with the environment, so that you're not adding that load to the production environment. Kind of some other considerations, of course, is you can separate your sessions, and you can leverage something called Cloudflare. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cloudflare, it's a CDN, WAF, and DDoS mitigation solution. It has a very low cost of entry. It actually starts free, and free is suitable for a lot of applications, and of course there's premium options, but there's caching of static assets that you can benefit from having distributed across a global edge. Cloudflare can help perform that. Of course, you could leverage other CDN type solutions and get the same result. But Cloudflare also has, load balancing capabilities. So you can have mirrored environments or mirrored web servers of multiple ColdFusion deployments, all hosting the same app, and Cloudflare can load balance that for you at the edge. It will pick the closest route to the visitor. And it really, beyond just the load balancing capability, the built-in WAF, and the security benefits you get. It's been a great tool from a scalability perspective. For applications that are cart intensive and cache heavy, or maybe have a lot of session storage, you can consider a standalone or highly available Redis implementation. I know Redis has gone through some licensing changes recently. There's been some controversy around that. There's other Redis alternatives out there. I think Valky comes to mind. So just keep that in mind as well. But this will even allow you to retain card information between restarts. So if let's say, in a load balance environment, if your visitors, are all getting routed to Web 1 and suddenly there's a failure and they get moved to Web 2, Redis will allow that card information to stay intact and your visitors wouldn't have to start over. For applications that have find that 90% of their Java heap space is consumed by session storage or the session scope within ColdFusion, I would start strongly looking into a Redis type deployment to offload that session storage to an external party. That way ColdFusion doesn't run into its own scalability issues. Of course, whenever you have sessions stored in ColdFusion locally or by default, when that instance gets restarted, if it's not clustered, you would lose those sessions. So as we think about scaling beyond that, or introducing kind of load balancing, you can separate your ColdFusion functionality into separate instances. If you have instances of multiple reports are generated, maybe that's its own CF server, or you're running several scheduled tasks. Are you able to offload those scripts to another host at another web server to kind of separate where that footprint, or all those intensive tasks are all done in one place? Early indicators for scaling considerations would be response time. If you're noticing response time is getting longer and longer, we could always look at load balancing. Maybe there's an issue within the app, but you could use load testing to help assess that. Your application's footprint, how much memory is being utilized as a server, can it be scaled more? Session availability, any cached objects or any third-party applications running alongside CF. Alrighty, I think that's the last slide. Yes. So I'll pause there. Are there any questions? Anything I can add additional insight on?
Thanks for that, sir. So if you look over there, you'll see, I can highlight them just to help show. We had one question asking, does this tool support all versions of CF app? And I believe at that time you were talking about JMeter. And so I'd already replied there saying such tools don't know how to spell CF. More to the point, they can be used with any version of CF. They don't see CF, they just see a web app. And right. I was referring to everything other than Fusion Reactor and the PMT, of course. And that got split over 2 comments. But anything else you might add?
Excellent. Well, I think that covers it. They're looking at it, at least these tools in particular are looking at it completely from an external perspective. So they won't know what code's running on the back end, and they're just looking to hit a remote endpoint. So
okay. And then there wasn't a question, but when you were talking about how load testing tools can create a lot of sessions, you said if they do like 1 million users, people need to be sensitive to the sessions that could be created. I just threw in a comment that on a related point, if a load testing tool doesn't honor and resend cookies, then each request they make will create a new session if your app enables session management. And this is true even if the tool simulates only 1 user, but makes thousands of requests. And a reason why that's a big impact is that your app would run the on-session start code on every request rather than just the first request in the session. And that can cause real trouble. And I know you know that, but I was throwing that out for others since I don't think you were necessarily making that point, although I know you were kind of making it, but you said 1 million users. And I just wanted to clarify it for people that, yeah, it doesn't matter how many users, it's really about the tool. And some tools, I'll just say real quick from my experience, that some tools, they don't even think about this, and every request they make without regard to sessions. And some tools out of the box understand this, and they're careful to, when they make their request first time, if it sends back a cookie, they honor that cookie and they send it back. And then a lot of other load testing tools, they let you choose which one you want, and they might default to one way or the other. And you really need to know which way they're working.
Yeah.
And then here, while we were talking, there was a new comment in legacy code. Is it usually better to try and create some kind of test script and load as opposed to hitting the actual code? Load the test script they added.
Okay. Yeah. If you're looking at a legacy environment, and maybe you're unable to test it, or you're worried about testing it, in a single production environment, you can look at separating components of your applications if that's easily replicatable. You could load test, components of your application outside of a legacy code base, and try to break those up. Of course, I would always recommend, testing in a development context or a staging context if possible. But yeah, if it's legacy code and it's just in one place, you could look at breaking that up, or maybe it's okay. I have seen scenarios where people are okay with testing in a production environment, and of course that's an option as well. But I don't know, Charlie, if you want to add any more color there. I think that's how I understood the question. But
right, I mean, I'll just say, if we're understanding their question correctly, I could see someone making an argument that when you're first getting started with a tool, you might want to start by having it point to some simple set of code that you wanted to test, just to learn how the tool works and to not stress your server and not trip over some of these problems we've talked about. So SCUBACY, I can't tell, it's SCUBACY. If you want to clarify what you're asking, feel free. But to the point you made there at the end about some people just run load tests against production, of course, in a best case scenario, one would have, a testing environment, staging servers, duplicating, replicating exactly what your architecture is of production, but very few people are able to do that, it seems. And so, yeah, it's a common circumstance for people to just go, screw it, we're load test against production. And at least you'll find out, what doesn't work well. And if you don't have a simulating environment, then that's better to do that than to wait and let real people trip over crap that only comes up under load testing.
Yeah.
I'll say that, I find a lot of people don't even bother with load testing, because the other way to look at it is people just go, all right, well, we'll just let the traffic be what it's going to be. And while we're on this topic, let's go ahead and throw this out for everybody, because Dakota and I, we know each other really well. We worked together for a long time. So I know he knows these things. I'm not saying them for him. I'm saying them for everybody else. Sometimes you think your site is handling X number of users because you in your code track how many, whatever you want to call them, logins or whatever. And then if you really dig further, you find out, holy smokes, we're doing a heck of a lot more load than we realize, because spiders and bots and hackers and scheduled tasks and monitoring tools and all kinds of crap, ChatGPT and Meta and many other AI agents are just trawling and crawling and beating your server. And I've found sometimes upwards of 80% of people's traffic was from that. Well, I bring this up to say, well, that's kind of load testing your server, because you may not realize how much stuff is happening that's way beyond what you expected. And then the converse is, sometimes people are going through all kinds of hoops and having trouble and solving problems, which really just come down to, hey, we got a bunch of crap that's beating our server up. And going back to what Dakota shared about Cloudflare, they have a feature now in Cloudflare on the free version, if you choose to enable it. It's a checkbox that says block AI bots, and they will block them coming in. And it's always a challenge with any WAF feature. Do you really want to do what the WAF feature allows? Do you really want to block what could be false positives? Or in the case of search agents, do you really want to block them because maybe they're going to find something useful that promotes your server or your site later down the road? But if someone knows, hey, no, they're killing us with their tens of thousands of requests per day, then yeah, just know that some WAFs and other proxy tools can also block it. And then there's code out there, and I've written about this for years. There's lots of other ways that you can throttle traffic coming into CF. But go ahead and say anything you might like to all that, Dakota.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great consideration, and of course, there's a lot of bot traffic out there. I think you gave the metric of probably 80% of requests at times, and I've definitely seen that, and I've also found that majority of the time bots are the reason servers run into issues, right? Particularly around sessions. If you're not if you're giving a session to every visitor, and a bot, an AI bot, or any kind of crawler out there is hitting your site, each one of those requests, they're not storing session information. They're not looking to accept it. That's just generating a new session,
just like we talked about before, right? So that's where these things act like load testing tools that don't honor cookies, and yeah, that can be what's killing people sometimes. So yeah, good stuff. Hey, while we're on the previous topic, Scubasi replied saying, sorry, I was curious about some code that may not be as modular and a function that does a bunch of things. So I want to test one piece of that.
Yeah.
I'll let you speak to that.
Okay. Yeah, I think, in any load testing scenario, you can craft like a special payload. Specifically, if you're talking about one function or one piece of that function, you can craft a payload that only invokes that part of it. So you have some flexibility there. You don't have to load test every element of it, and you could focus on that one core component. Of course, if you want to separate it, you're more than welcome to, but I don't see any issues with just testing one component of that function. So
very good.
Awesome.
Anybody else? Hey, while we wait for anybody else to ask any follow-up questions, sometimes people think theirs isn't worth blocking other people from asking theirs. Well, now's your chance. If you have any, now's your chance. Get it in. While we're waiting, I'm curious, Dakota, would you feel comfortable showing how easily K6 can build a script from a recording of a session? Because I'm sure some people would be far more compelled to consider such a tool when they see that they don't have to code anything. Like JMeter can do that, and others can do that. And you said K6 can do that. Is that something you're comfortable just quickly doing a demo of, or does it take some effort? You don't have the right software installed, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I don't have it set up on this environment, but I think a takeaway for that, I could happily post, some kind of demonstration after the fact, but it is very streamlined, and I could take that as a takeaway.
Okay.
But sorry about that.
Okay. So here was a follow-up question. In your tuning tips and tricks slide, can you give more info on reuse connector threshold? Which, do you mean the max connection reuse? There's max connections and connection reuse. Anyway, if you have a screen that was showing that, I might have looked away. I didn't see that. Or do you want to talk about it without even showing that slide?
Yeah, I think it's in relation to the Tomcat.
The connector. Yep.
So there are threshold connector that can be essentially define what number of simultaneous requests can be supported from the web server that's being passed back to Tomcat for processing. For your particular question about the reuse thresholds,
I just looked it up. It's max reuse connections. I'd forgotten because it's been a while since I've had to dig into it. So there's max reuse connections, and then there's connection pool size.
Right.
That's what I assume you're talking about, Mard. And I'll just throw out before he might offer anything. Adobe had discussed those two ad nauseum in blog posts back when this all came out, first in CF10 and then in CF11. So I'll just tell you that, if you were to Google those phrases and include the word ColdFusion in them, you should find that you would be pointed to those blog posts. I sure hope you would. And there was considerable discussion of them back then. And I'll just say real quickly that the connection pool size in the workers.properties file, that is a pure Tomcat thing. But the max reuse connections, which is also in that file, that is not a Tomcat thing. That's something Adobe added. And they never really fully documented it. And back then in CF10 era, they were saying they were going to release the source code that showed us what it was doing, and they never did. So it's still not 100% clear. But anyway, do you want to share it? I have other thoughts I could share, but Dakota, did you want to say anything else about that?
Yeah, I think the reuse connections threshold, it's really just a matter, however, ColdFusion and their backend is reusing, pre-existing connections that have been established to Tomcat. So I think I want to say that defaults to 250. It may act a little lower. But that can be tuned to allow more connections to be reused instead of being reopened. Presumably, there's some kind of performance impact in relation to that, where if you're not having to reopen a new connection on every request, and an old one can just be reused, obviously that would have a positive performance implication. But yeah, it's specifically in relation to how many connections are opened to Tomcat and whether or not those are going to be reused, or what's the threshold for reusing them. So as you increase your pool size, I assume you can increase that reuse connector threshold in tandem as well.
Well, I'll share with you a summary of what Adobe was getting at when they announced this stuff back in CF10, CF11 era. It's just shame that they've never really well documented it since. So again, I know people aren't seeing anything on screen, so it may be a little hard to get in your heads. But again, we're talking about in that workers properties file for a given connector. Yes, since 2016, the default was connection pool size of 500, max reuse connections of 250. And then also in CF 2016, they started adding the option for you to choose between small, medium, and large, and those numbers would change. But they were always a 50% ratio. And that's the key I want to share, since Amard's asked the question. That 500, 250 is a 50%, split. And the way Adobe back in that era, CF10, 11, talked about it was they said you should divide your number of sites, the pool size, by the number of sites using that connector. So if a given connector was using one site, then it was 500 divided by 1. So conceivably, you could think each site could use 500 connections. And if there was 2 sites, then 500 divided by 2, each site could use 250 connections. And 500 divided by 5, each site could use 100 connections. Well, there was a 500 limit that they could all use. And they explained back then that the max reuse connections was kind of a limiter of what each site could use. So you might think, well, if I've got 500 as the pool size and 5 sites, then 500 divided by 5 is 100. Well, if the max reuse connection says 250, then it thinks that each site can use 250. But that's not possible, because 5 times 250 would be 750. So again, according to what Adobe said, and experience over the years from myself and others, I think this is what Dakota was getting at, is you would want to, in effect, ramp down that max reuse connection size. Again, they literally said it in their docs back then in the thread of the blog post, the discussion. They said, so it should be 500 and 100 if you had 5 sites. Now, naturally, somebody would go, but what if I've got 50 sites? Are you telling me that it should be 10? And then that's when it became a different discussion of, well, then maybe you should raise the connection pool size. And then the debate was, well, what if you do raise it? Oh, you can make it 5,100, and that would cover 50 sites. And there was a lot of back and forth. It was like hundreds of discussion thread comments back then. And again, a lot of it's lost to history because people don't find stuff that's that old or don't dig that far down into the blog post. And heck, even a lot of the discussion back then was lost because they moved to a new blog form and half the comments were lost. But, Amard, you asked the question. I'm just sharing that's some of the consideration. Now, one other thing I'll just throw out, is the PMT, the ColdFusion Performance Monitoring Toolset that came out in CF 2018. One of its features is it said, we will auto-tune the connector for you, they asserted. And they would tweak the values as they perceived they should be tweaked. I don't know about your experience with that, Dakota, but I've found it to be questionable how well that it does that. Like, I don't think it can raise the pool size. I think the best they could do was modify that reuse connections size, and that's not the answer if they need more pool size. But anyway, I never really dug into it because it's, again, not well discussed, not well documented, not well populated, in the interface of the PMT even. But anyway, do you have anything else you'd add to any of that stuff I'd said?
But no, I appreciate your insight on it, and I think even from the performance monitoring toolset perspective, I've seen very minor adjustments in the few cases I've used it. So I don't know if that's a good thing or what the threshold for them adjusting the actual connector is. And I'd love to learn more about that or get more information about that.
Yeah, that'd be one that'd be nice. And by the way, thank you, Imard, for your comment there. You said, love the expanded views on the connector settings. So yeah, it'd be great someday to have Adobe give a presentation on that topic. And I just wonder sometimes who on their team really does understand it, because you had to have been around back to that time frame to appreciate what was being communicated. And I just don't know. Some of it's probably been lost to history. But anyway, while we're still alive, we'll keep spreading the good news. So anybody else, anything else? I think we're kind of done with the questions and comments. If so, unless you have anything else you want to add, Dakota.
I think just be on this slide.
Yeah, cool. Perfect.
Thank you, everyone. Keep yourself informed. There's several Adobe CF resources out there that are available to you. I always point everyone to the CF community Slack, the Adobe CF bug tracker. So if you're seeing unexpected behavior in your app, someone may be experiencing the same thing, and maybe there's a workaround or an issue that needs to be upvoted. There's a CF programmers group on Facebook. There's a huge LinkedIn community. Of course, we have Charlie's blog. xByte Cloud has their own blog. Just be aware of the resources out there and ask questions, or feel free to reach out. And thank you for the time today. So.
Thank you, sir. And by the way, I just shared in a link in the chat. I mean, I know you've got links there, but nobody can click on them. But I'll share that I shared in the chat a link. So some of you may know I have a CF411.com site, and it's just a big page of tools and resources. And one of the sections is on social help resources, and there's the things he lists and a few more. So each one of those things are there. Oh, and then he mentions our blogs. I have a separate section on blogs and also pointers to blog aggregating tools. So a cool thing is you can just follow one of the blog aggregators, and any CF blog that makes a comment, you'd get fed news of that blog. So anyway, that's another section in the CF 411. But that link will at least get you to the link to the CF Slack, the programmers group, and the community group. And then the bug tracker, if you don't know it, I also have that in there. But anyway, the bug tracker is tracker.adobe.com for those who don't know. And it's amazing how many people don't know. They go, wait, what? There's a public place to ask about bugs? Yes, there is. Tracker.adobe.com. Let me just share one more of the tip on that since it came up. Starting last year, like December of last year, the mechanism for Tracker stopped sending emails. So you didn't know if people were commenting or voting on your bugs. And it should have been. It always was. And I raised that a few months ago, and it still was not solved. Have you by any chance noticed, Dakota, if that's been resolved? Do you get any emails? I don't think so. No, because I don't get any emails.
No.
Yeah. So just be aware of that. But still, no reason not to get your bugs in, because Adobe gets notified of them. I'm just saying, when people comment or vote on them, we who created the bug report, or anybody who did participate in the bug, would get notified when anybody else added a comment. And that's gone, unfortunately, and I hope they'll bring it back someday. But definitely do file your bug reports, because they fix them. You know,
Yep.
about every 4 or 5 CF updates is a bug fix update. In between is mostly security updates, but then every few updates they do a big bug fix with dozens of bug fixes. So it's definitely worth getting them out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen workarounds posted, and even minor patches that get released as a workaround before
Yeah.
an actual hot fix. So
And that's another thing that you might get notified of by a comment, but if you don't get the email, you don't know. But sometimes that's where you can reach out to Adobe and ask them about it, and they'll send you a patch or something like that.
right.
Hey, one other thing, just quick, I just remembered too that on my CF411 site, I do also have load testing tools. So there's more than the ones he'd mentioned. In fact, we had a talk about a year and a half ago from yet another one that's called Octoperf. And Octoperf actually is like a interface on top of JMeter. So to the degree that some people didn't care for JMeter's UI, Octoperf took it a step further. And so again, there's a CFMeetup talk. So if you just go, you all who are looking at the YouTube videos right now, if you're seeing the playlist, I have a playlist of all the videos back to 2015 when we started putting them on YouTube, and you can find that Octoperf presentation in the playlist there. So, all right. Well, if there's nothing else, we'll let you get going. Thank you, Dakota, for coming on. Sorry for keeping everybody for just a few more minutes beyond the top of the hour, but hope it was valuable.
Thank you for having me.
You betcha. So long, everybody.